Frank sat on a weathered wooden bench outside Scripps Mercy Hospital in San Diego, his hands clasped so tightly on top of his cane that his knuckles had turned white. The afternoon sun poured over the city, making the glass panels of the hospital shimmer, but it brought him no warmth. Inside, his wife Margaret lay in the ICU, her once strong frame now fragile and still. For more than 50 years, she had been the constant in his life. The one who made their small house near the harbor feel like home. The one who laughed at his dry humor even when no one else did. But the rare blood disorder that had taken root in her body was winning, and the doctor's words from earlier echoed in his mind like a cruel refrain. We are running out of options. That morning, she had been awake just long enough to tell him, "It's okay to let me go, Frank," before slipping back into a medicated haze. He had kissed her forehead, whispered he loved her, and walked out to clear his head, not sure if he'd have another chance to say those words while she was conscious. The smell of disinfectant still clung to his clothes, mixing with the faint salt of the ocean breeze. But it was the mechanical beeping and shallow hiss of oxygen from her room that haunted his thoughts. He stared at the parking lot without really seeing it, fighting back the helplessness building in his chest. Then, as he shifted on the bench, the side entrance to the hospital opened, and two nurses in blue scrubs stepped outside, talking in low voices. He hadn't meant to listen, but their words floated clearly through the warm air. "You know that woman in ICU, Carter?" one asked. Her husband, "He looks just like that Henderson guy up in Pine Valley. I swear, it's uncanny." The other nurse replied without hesitation. "Yeah, but even if they are related, finding him officially would take too much time. And you know how donor searches are. No guarantee it'd work out anyway." They laughed lightly, as if it was nothing, then walked toward the staff parking lot. Frank stayed completely still, his mind suddenly sharper than it had been in days. Henderson. Pine Valley. A name, a place, something the hospital clearly wasn't going to pursue. The mention of a possible connection stirred an old memory, faint but persistent, from stories Margaret's father once told about distant relatives in the mountains. And now, with the nurse's casual dismissal still ringing in his ears, Frank's grief began to shift into something else: cold determination. If there was even a small chance this Henderson could help save Margaret's life, he was going to find him. And if he discovered the hospital had knowingly ignored that chance, then whoever made that decision was going to regret it. He didn't know how yet, but after a lifetime of quiet resolve, Frank knew one thing. Once he set his mind to something, he never stopped until it was done. Frank rose from the bench with the slow, deliberate motion of a man whose joints protested every move but whose will refused to give in. He didn't want to return to Margaret's room just yet. He needed space to think. The nurses' voices replayed in his head, word for word, tone for tone. They had said Henderson like it was just another name on a long list. But to Frank, it was the sound of a door cracking open when he thought all exits were sealed. He walked to his old Ford parked under the shade of a jacaranda tree, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there gripping the wheel, staring out at the street. Pine Valley. He knew it well enough. 2 hours east, tucked in the mountains, the kind of place where people fixed their own fences and waved at passing cars. He'd driven through it on fishing trips years ago, but never had a reason to stop. Now it might hold the only person who could save his wife. He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts, scrolling past family and old Navy friends, hesitating before pressing the number of an old buddy, Charlie West. Charlie had been a radio operator in the service, and after retiring, he'd made a habit of finding people for friends who needed it. When Charlie answered with his usual gravelly, "Talk to me," Frank wasted no time. "I need an address on a Henderson in Pine Valley. Could be middle-aged, maybe older. It's urgent." Charlie didn't ask why, just grunted and said, "Give me a few hours." That was the thing about old service friends. You didn't need to explain the stakes. They just understood. Frank hung up and started the engine, deciding to head home to gather anything he might need for a trip. The drive along Harbor Drive was busy with tourists and locals, but Frank barely noticed the scenery. His mind was already running 2 tracks. 1, the hope of finding Henderson. 2, the growing suspicion that the hospital had chosen not to follow this lead because it wasn't worth their time. That thought sparked a slow-burning anger in him. In his years as a Navy man and later as a contractor, Frank had learned the difference between mistakes and deliberate neglect. This smelled like the latter, and if that was the truth, then someone had gambled with Margaret's life. At home, Frank moved through their small house with its low ceilings and framed photographs like a man on a mission. He pulled a worn duffel bag from the closet, tossed in a change of clothes, a shaving kit, his old service flashlight, and the folder of Margaret's medical records he kept in the desk drawer. He stopped for a moment in the kitchen, looking at the empty coffee cup she'd left on the counter before her last hospital stay. That cup had sat there for weeks, and he hadn't touched it, almost as if moving it would admit she might not come home. He set it gently in the sink, then went to the living room and retrieved an old shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were letters, some faded photographs, and a few documents from Margaret's side of the family. He flipped through them until a name caught his eye: Thomas Henderson. Written on the back of a decades-old Christmas card from a relative Margaret barely remembered. No return address, just Pine Valley in looping script. His gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. By late afternoon, Charlie called back. "Got your guy. Luke Henderson lives on County Road 6 out in Pine Valley. Small farmhouse, white paint, peeling. No wife, works odd jobs. You going up there?" Frank said, "Tonight," and hung up. He grabbed the duffel, locked up the house, and slid into the Ford. As he pulled out, the Pacific was on his right, calm and glinting under the lowering sun. It struck him that Margaret might never see it again if this failed. That thought steeled him for the long drive ahead. The highway east wound through suburban sprawl before giving way to rolling hills and finally to the thick pines of the mountains. As the sun sank, the road narrowed, cracked pavement weaving through shadows. By the time he turned onto County Road 6, dusk had settled in. The farmhouse appeared just as Charlie had described: white paint curling off the siding, a rusted swing swaying in the evening breeze, a porch light flickering weakly. Frank parked by the mailbox with Henderson in faded letters, climbed the wooden steps, and knocked. It took a moment, but the door creaked open to reveal a tall man, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped, with hair the color of sun-faded wheat and eyes so blue, Frank felt a jolt in his chest. They were Margaret's eyes, or her father's. The resemblance was undeniable. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone cautious. Frank held up a photograph from his wallet, Margaret at 30, smiling in their backyard. "This is my wife. She's in the hospital. The doctors say she needs a bone marrow transplant, and some people think you might be family." Luke stared at the photo for a long moment, his brow furrowing, then softening. "She looks like my aunt. My mother had a sister she lost touch with before I was born. Always wondered what happened to her. If she's your wife, then yeah, we're kin." He stepped aside. "Come in." The inside smelled faintly of pine and coffee, the furniture worn but clean. Frank explained the situation, watching Luke's face shift from confusion to understanding to resolve. "I'll do it," Luke said finally. "If I'm a match, I'm in. Family's family." The simple certainty in his voice was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. As they made arrangements to leave for San Diego that night, Frank felt something he hadn't in days: hope. But it was tempered by the knowledge that the hospital could have found Luke if they'd bothered. That failure wasn't something Frank planned to forget or forgive. Frank and Luke left Pine Valley under a sky that had turned a deep indigo, the air crisp with the scent of pine and the faint dampness of an approaching fog. Frank led the way in his Ford, Luke following close behind in an old pickup that rattled slightly over the mountain roads. As the miles passed and the road widened, Frank kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Not just to check Luke was still there, but to reassure himself that this wasn't some fever dream brought on by exhaustion and desperation. The closer they drew to San Diego, the more the tension in Frank's shoulders eased. Yet beneath the relief was a coiled strand of anger, thin but unbreakable. He thought again about the nurse's conversation, about how casually they had dismissed a lead that could mean life or death. It hadn't been uncertainty that stopped them. It had been unwillingness. Maybe the process was costly. Maybe the hospital didn't see the point for an elderly woman who didn't fit their success story criteria. Either way, Frank knew he would keep this knowledge close until the time came to use it. They reached the city in the small hours of the morning. The streetlights along the harbor shimmered on the calm black water as they approached Scripps Mercy Hospital. Luke looked tired, but determined when he stepped from his truck, duffel bag in hand. "You ready for this?" Frank asked quietly. "If it helps her, I'm ready," Luke replied without hesitation. Inside, the night staff seemed caught off guard when Frank introduced Luke as a possible donor. A nurse led them to a waiting area while paging the hematology team. Frank noted the flicker of surprise on their faces and filed it away like another piece of evidence. He imagined them wondering how an old man had done in a day what the hospital hadn't bothered to do in weeks. The tests began almost immediately. Blood samples, tissue typing, and a battery of questions for Luke about his health history. Frank sat beside him during the waiting periods, answering only when necessary, mostly letting Luke rest his eyes between the pokes and prods. In the quiet moments, they exchanged pieces of family history. How Luke's mother had died young, how Margaret's father had drifted away from his own siblings, leaving gaps in their family tree that had never been filled. Frank realized that this was more than a search for a donor. It was the reattachment of severed roots, the knitting together of something fractured decades ago. By mid-morning, the hematologist approached, her expression softer than Frank had yet seen. "Mr. Henderson," she began, "you're a very strong match, one of the best we've had for a transplant in some time." Luke exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then let's get started." Frank felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He gripped the handle of his cane tightly, forcing himself to stay composed. The procedure would be scheduled as soon as possible, given Margaret's condition. When Frank went to her room to tell her, she was awake, her eyes clouded, but curious. "Frank?" she whispered, her voice scratchy. "I found someone," he said gently, leaning closer. "A family member. He's a match." Margaret blinked, confusion flickering before tears welled. "Family?" she repeated. Frank nodded, deciding in that moment to spare her the details of how close she'd come to being written off. "Yes, Maggie, family." She closed her eyes, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Then I guess I'm not as alone as I thought." Later, while Margaret rested, Frank stepped out into the courtyard with Luke. "I'm not sure if I should be thanking you or apologizing," Frank admitted. Luke looked at him squarely. "Don't apologize. If someone I cared about was dying and I could do something, I'd want them to find me." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of distant traffic mixing with the soft hiss of the courtyard fountain. Then Frank said, "There's something you should know. The hospital. They could have found you if they tried. They didn't." Luke's jaw tightened. "Why?" Frank shrugged, though the answer was already clear in his mind. "Because she's old. Because maybe she's not the kind of patient they want for their statistics. I don't know. But I plan to find out." As they walked back inside, Frank felt the shape of his plan beginning to solidify. He wouldn't rush it. No, that wasn't his way. Revenge, he'd learned long ago, worked best when it was methodical, precise, and unseen until the moment it landed. For now, the only thing that mattered was getting Margaret through the procedure alive. But in the background, behind every polite smile he gave to the staff, he was taking mental notes, memorizing names, times, and faces. Every detail would matter later. That night, Luke stayed in the family waiting room while Frank sat by Margaret's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The hospital was quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the smallest sounds, the creak of a chair, the beep of a monitor, feel amplified. Frank thought about the long road that had brought them here, about the thin thread of chance that had led him to overhear those nurses. He wondered how many other patients had never been that lucky. The thought hardened his resolve. The people who had let Margaret slip toward death without lifting a finger would see consequences, even if it took him the rest of his life to make it happen. For now, though, he simply reached out, took her hand in his, and whispered, "We're almost there, Maggie. Hold on." The morning of the procedure dawned gray over San Diego, the marine layer rolling in from the Pacific and casting the hospital in a muted light. Frank arrived early, cane tapping softly against the polished floor as he made his way to the pre-op area where Luke was being prepped. The younger man sat on the edge of a narrow bed, hospital gown tied loosely, a faint smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. Nurses moved around them with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, marking charts. Luke caught Frank's eye and offered a half smile. "Never thought I'd be giving bone marrow to someone I just met," he said quietly. "But it feels right." Frank nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching upward for the first time in days. "You're not giving it to a stranger, Luke. You're giving it to family." The staff led Luke away, and Frank was left alone in the waiting area, the silence broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional murmur of hospital staff passing by. He sat there, hands folded over his cane, appearing calm, but in his mind, he was cataloging every interaction from the past 48 hours. The startled expressions when he'd brought Luke in, the evasive tone in certain administrators' voices, the way no one had congratulated him for finding the match himself. These details were puzzle pieces he was already fitting together for what would come after today. Margaret's prep took place in another part of the ward, and when Frank visited her room, she looked fragile but more alert than she had in weeks. "Luke's in there now," Frank told her, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "They'll bring you to the OR soon." She reached for his hand, her skin cool, but her grip unexpectedly firm. "Promise me you'll rest, Frank, no matter how this goes." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'll rest when you're home." She tried to smile, but it faltered under the weight of her exhaustion. He didn't tell her about the anger coiling in him like a spring, about the quiet investigation he was already pursuing. She didn't need that burden. Hours crawled by with the steady tick of the wall clock. Frank alternated between pacing the hallway and sitting in the courtyard to clear his head. In one corner of the courtyard, a pair of nurses stood smoking, speaking in hushed tones about another patient whose insurance wouldn't cover an experimental treatment. "They're just going to send him home," one of them said. "Not worth the fight, I guess." Frank absorbed every word without turning his head, confirming what he already suspected. Decisions here weren't always about medicine. They were about money and metrics. That knowledge hardened into resolve. He had fought battles before, on deck, in courtrooms, in city council meetings when crooked developers tried to shortchange his neighborhood. He knew how to pick his ground and his moment. By late afternoon, both Luke's and Margaret's procedures were complete. Luke returned to recovery pale but steady, managing a tired grin when Frank stepped in. "They say it went well," Luke murmured, his voice hoarse. "She's in the ICU, but stable." Relief hit Frank so sharply that his eyes burned. He clasped Luke's shoulder. "You did more than you know, son." Later, when Frank was finally allowed into Margaret's ICU room, he saw a faint blush of color on her cheeks, a steadier rhythm in the heart monitor's beeps. He sat beside her, watching her sleep, the rise and fall of her chest like a metronome pulling him back from the edge of fear. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe she might come home. Still, as he sat there, Frank's thoughts drifted to what came next. He imagined the faces of the hospital's board members when confronted with proof that they had ignored a viable donor lead. He thought about the paper trail he was building, Luke's address, the time frame, the overheard conversation, the lack of any documented search. He had already begun discreetly asking friendly staff for copies of internal search logs, framing it as wanting to understand the process better. The truth was, he was collecting ammunition. He didn't know yet whether he would drop it anonymously to the press or confront the administration directly, but he knew he would strike in a way that couldn't be dismissed. That night, Frank stood in the hospital parking lot, the city lights spread out before him like a constellation. He called Charlie, updating him on Margaret's condition, and then, in a lower voice, outlining what he had learned about the hospital's negligence. "You're playing the long game, huh?" Charlie asked. Frank's gaze drifted back to the glowing windows of the ICU. "I'm making sure no one else's wife has to survive because her husband happened to overhear the right conversation." His voice was steady, but in his chest the vow felt like steel. Margaret's life had been spared, but this was no ending. It was the beginning of something else, a reckoning that would arrive quietly, without warning, until the people responsible found themselves answering questions they couldn't escape. And when that day came, Frank knew he wouldn't need to raise his voice. The truth would speak loudly enough. The weeks after the transplant unfolded slowly, like a tide pulling back from a storm. Margaret's strength returned in small increments. First, the ability to sit up for more than a few minutes. Then short walks down the corridor with Frank's steady arm for support. Luke stayed nearby, splitting his time between the hospital and a small motel by the harbor. His presence a steady comfort in the tense recovery phase. Frank made sure to keep the atmosphere light for Margaret, telling old stories about their early years in San Diego, about the time a pelican had stolen his lunch right off the pier, or when she had convinced him to dance at a Navy ball after 3 whiskeys. But beneath the humor and the careful optimism, Frank's mind was still working in quiet, deliberate strokes toward the justice he had promised himself. He now had copies of donor search records from a sympathetic clerk, showing that the hospital had flagged a possible family match based on physical resemblance, but had closed the lead without follow-up. He had the exact date and time the nurses discussed Henderson in the courtyard, along with Charlie's affidavit confirming that within hours, Frank had tracked Luke down with nothing more than that single name and location. He also had a growing list of other cases where donor leads were ignored, each story shared in whispered confidence by relatives of patients who hadn't been as lucky as Margaret. When Margaret was finally discharged, Luke followed them home in his old pickup, the 3 of them arriving at the small house near the harbor, just as the late afternoon sun painted the sky in streaks of gold. The homecoming felt almost ceremonial, Frank unlocking the door, Margaret stepping inside to breathe in the familiar scent of salt air and wood polish. Luke setting down a basket of groceries on the counter without being asked. That night, they ate together at the old oak table, the one Frank had refinished decades earlier, the air thick with the unspoken relief of surviving something that had felt unbeatable. Margaret didn't know about the hospital's deliberate inaction. Frank had decided early on that she didn't need the weight of that truth. To her, Luke's arrival was simply a miracle of timing and family fate, and Frank was determined to let her keep it that way. But outside of their quiet home, Frank's slow-burn retaliation was taking shape. He had sent an anonymous package to an investigative journalist at the local paper, one known for chasing medical corruption stories. It contained everything: donor search logs, timelines, statements, and even a discreet audio recording of one nurse admitting offhand that we can't chase every lead. Some aren't worth the effort. Frank didn't sign his name, but he didn't need to. The truth had its own weight. Within weeks, the paper's first article ran under the headline, "San Diego Hospital Under Fire for Neglecting Life-Saving Donor Leads." What started as one story became a series, drawing in testimony from other families, former staff, and legal experts. Frank watched the fallout quietly from his kitchen table, sipping black coffee as the news anchor spoke words like systemic negligence and ethics investigation. Board members resigned. Lawsuits stacked up. Funding was frozen pending inquiry. For the first time, the people who had gambled with lives were being forced into the light. Through it all, Frank kept his focus on Margaret's recovery. Some days were harder than others. Her energy would dip, old fatigue creeping back. But every evening they sat together on the porch, watching the Pacific shift from blue to silver under the setting sun. Luke often joined them, the 3 of them falling into easy silences, bound now by more than blood. On one especially clear night, Margaret leaned her head against Frank's shoulder and murmured, "I don't know how I got so lucky." Frank just kissed her hair and said, "We make our own luck, Maggie." She smiled, never knowing how true that was. Months later, long after the hospital had become a byword for scandal, Frank took a walk along the harbor at dawn. The air was cool, the sky streaked pink, and fishermen were already hauling their gear onto the docks. His phone buzzed, a message from the journalist. "They're going to trial. Your work made this possible." Frank stared at the water for a long moment, feeling no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. Margaret was safe. The guilty were cornered, and the city knew the truth. He headed home, the day warming around him, knowing there was no need for anyone to ever connect the quiet old man on the harbor with the storm that had rolled through Scripps Mercy. His revenge had never been about noise. It was about precision, about making sure those who thought they could play God learned they were not untouchable. As he turned up the path to his front door, the sound of Margaret's laughter drifted out through the open window, and Frank thought, That's the only victory I ever needed.